Welcome back to Vivid Earth, everyone. Today I have the joy and pleasure of having SG Anon back for another update. And it's been a couple of months, and we missed you over here on YouTube. SG, how are you?
Doing well, Anina. It's good to be back.
It's good to have you. We were just chatting before we started recording about you know, different things going on in the world. Spoke about the war in Iran. It's now starting to affect a lot of people in a lot of different countries on a lot of different levels. And many people are very unhappy and they expect things to just be over now and, life to return to normal. And we're just talking about that, the fact that there will be some consequences. This is a war. But what is the alternative? And what was the alternative going to be not doing this? So with any cleanup, there's going to be, some casualties of war, and the fact that Q said the end is not for everyone. And I think what maybe he or it meant with that was that a lot of people were not maybe going to hold their faith until the end. They were going to fall out of the bus before we even get to the end, because it will get quite sticky and really difficult towards the end. Darkest before the dawn, isn't it? What's your view on that?
Well, it's very interesting, and I think that that's a great place to start the discussion and frame the overall conversation today. When Q came out and told the world that this was going to transform planet Earth, and that's essentially, I'm paraphrasing several drops, sort of combining those meanings, but that was the takeaway. This is going to be a transformative process that will lead to a new way of life and a new way of understanding between one another as we go forward through our life journey here as humanity on this planet. I think a lot of people, sort of got pigeonholed into the idea that it was going to transform politics but leave other areas alone, or that it was going to transform finance and clean out the political election system but leave business constructs or corporate constructs intact, or worldwide energy markets and how they've been fleshed out over the last 150 to 250 years. And that's simply not the case. As we look at what's happening in the world, this is a transformative period of time that is essentially going to act as a pivot point for all of humanity from an overall civilization standpoint. This is a fork in the road of destiny, if there ever was one. And when you said just a moment ago, people expecting things to go back to normal, we are not going back to normal. There's not going to be a pre-2020 normal that will ever be achieved on this earth again. What's
Yeah.
happening now is the construction of a new normal and a simultaneous deconstruction of the old world, of the old normal, if you will, the old norms, the expectations that we all have about things like life, finance, economy, law, court systems, our interactions with one another, even in some cases, spirituality itself. And so, looking at what's happening in the Iran war, or the situation that kicked off with Venezuela, which was very short lived, sort of like a flash in the pan, or what President Trump has told the mainstream press several times just in the last few weeks, that Cuba is next. The expansion of military operations coming to Ukraine very, very soon. Russia just called up another 200,000 reservists and placed them on active duty and deployed them to what is southeastern Europe. It's southwestern Russia, but southeastern Europe. Looking at what's occurring right now, these are the punctuation marks of that move towards a new world, a different way of doing things. It would not be possible, for example, to revalue worldwide financial ecosystems without taking the problems out of the old ecosystem. And Iran was a huge, huge problem, and not just the only one. It would not be possible to assign real value to nation state resources without removing the Cartel de los Soles and its partnership of the intelligence community and several intelligence aligned gangs down there in South America out of Caracas, because you would never get an honest reflection of the metrics of what that country actually holds on to from a resource valuation standpoint. The same is true of Greenland. Denmark has been misleading the entire world since the since the mid 20th century with respect to the valuations of resources there in that area that they've been, holding as essentially a post-colonial power for a long time. And that doesn't even get into the secret technology that they've hidden up there, or the interactions that NATO has had with non-terrestrial beings, which have been coordinated through the Arctic shelf, and some of that has been done through Greenland. So looking at what's happening right now in the world, I completely understand, I empathize with the idea that we should not be pursuing greater conflict, that we should not be orienting ourselves in this fashion to walk down this regime change road or this military adventuristic road or all the different terminologies that people and labels that people apply to these events. But we cannot look at these events with the same understanding of how they have always happened in the past. This is the inversion of things that were done to humanity in a negative way over the last 100 years or so. It's sort of like a tapestry that has been woven in one way, but you want to take it apart and reweave it in another fashion. You cannot just destroy the tapestry because then you have nothing left to work with. But you cannot weave a new tapestry over top of all the seams, of all the thread work, of all the various nodes and intersections in the old tapestry either. You have to take the tapestry apart bit by bit, being as careful as you can to only snip things where is necessary and then preserve as much of that thread as possible for reuse with the new tapestry. And that's exactly what we're seeing happening right now. And it is difficult, I think, for a lot of individuals to reconcile that process because on the surface, even from the alt media, and I'm glad that we have an alternative media ecosystem that's now been built, but even from the alt media, we're not deep diving and understanding things at a multi-angular level. We're not going dimensional with our understanding of things. We're not looking at the secret societies in the Middle East who are being decimated by what's happening right now inside of Iran. We're not looking at the destruction of rogue missile systems and rogue armament systems, most of which were completely off book and never declared to the world. A lot of them not even declared to the civilian government inside of Tehran for a long time. We're not acknowledging that that is something that's also happening. We're not acknowledging that the Rockefeller oil complex that built its entire centralization construct around the world and centered a great deal of it in the Middle East is also being decimated as a result of what's happening now. We're not looking at the redefinition of trade routes and shipping lanes, forcing very large countries and medium-sized countries to be more regional in their approach with things like energy, with things like grain, with things like critical minerals and critical access to things that are important for those nations. So all of these and more are considerations that have to be baked into the pie. And if we're not looking at those and allowing those to be incorporated into the recipe, it's very easy to walk away with this sort of incomplete misunderstanding of what's happening and a very significant emotional reaction that may not yet be necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. Very well said. And, you know, it's quite interesting how Trump is trolling a lot of people at the moment. And, a lot of people find it quite distasteful and, but, we are in the fog of war. So you cannot take things literally. People just need to understand. And perhaps it's okay. We don't even need to correct people because we know this is the darkest night, darkest of night before the dawn right now. And this is the fog of war. No, not everything is as it seems. In fact, very little is as it seems. So, people need to understand there's something very, very big at play here. And when they realize what has been happening, truly happening behind the scenes, and not just the missiles flying back and forth, they will be, absolutely shocked when they realize what has been going on underground, what has been destroyed, what has been retrieved in terms of gold, what has been destroyed in terms of weapons. The magnitude of that is just incredible. Now, quick question, a lot of people say a lot of what we see playing out now is the movie. A lot of what we see now has already happened. But what do you think? It feels like what is happening now is quite real and quite real time, as opposed to a scene playing itself out. What do you think the timing of that and how we see real events playing out versus what may be a rendition for the stage, so to speak?
Well, I think when we talk about a movie, there are multiple different component parts to a movie, but the biggest takeaway that I would extrapolate from that expression of things is that a movie can be a real event happening in real time, but following a script that has already been determined. And I think that's what we're seeing in a lot of this, perhaps not all of it, but certainly with a lot of this. The Maduro situation that occurred in January was absolutely textbook in that format, right? We saw, essentially this seamless operation that occurred, very limited, and I mean like very, very limited injuries on the side of the U.S. military. We did see quite a lot of injuries from the Cuban mafia, who have been part of the broader intelligence control arm that has existed in the Caribbean and Central America and South America as well for a long time. The Cuban mafia is sort of like the intersection between the Latin American cartels and those very large transnational gangs and the mobsters out of Eastern Europe, to include former Soviet oligarchs and things like that. So, looking at that, you have what I believe in that scenario, the obvious capitulation from Maduro, the understanding that Maduro was going to be extracted from that situation, however it occurred. And in exchange for that extraction, the man was going to get to live. Whereas in the previous arrangement, I would submit to you that it would have been almost a foregone conclusion that he would not have survived had he maintained his exposure to that community as that shadow state continued to be more and more exposed, because he was a liability. He was a loose end. And so when we look at those types of things, you can clearly tell that there's been some sort of agreement, some sort of an arrangement that has been arrived at here to allow those things to move forward seamlessly. Kim Jong-un is another good example of that. Kim was actually an example that was utilized by Q a number of times to show to the world that much of these conversations were being had in the background. They were being had outside of the awareness of both the mainstream media and the deep state players, so the intelligence community, various factions and various gangs that were in control of economies in certain places, certainly the bankers being sidelined and not involved in those conversations. And so in that sense, you also have some scripting, if you will. Here's basically a loose idea of what's going to happen. Here's the part that we need you to do in order to make sure that these things move forward effectively. Are you willing to do this? Yes or no? And then you end up with some sort of, tentative, sort of like tenuous agreement about how to move forward, but an agreement nonetheless. And President Trump described his relationship with quote unquote Little Rocket Man very positively after the meeting that occurred in Singapore. So I would submit that the same is true of a lot of these events that are happening now in the world, but that does not mean that everyone either agreed to the postulation that was put forth to them or was even aware of what was going to come their way. If this was a discussion between, say, patriots inside the Western world militaries and the IRGC, for example, that probably did not occur in a quote unquote movie fashion, because that is a terrorist extension of the intelligence community at its core. That's literally walking into the viper's den and giving them your playbook. And that doesn't make any sense to do. And so when we look at what's happening right now in the world, I think that we are seeing the fleshing out of a quote unquote plan, a scripted movie on the parts of certain individuals that are forcing other individuals into untenable situations that they cannot get out of. The IRGC is certainly one of those in the present day and time, but I would characterize the Likud government in Tel Aviv, which has been controlled by the Israeli Mossad for a very long time, as another component piece and part of that. And I'll double down on that and I'll say that the rumors of Netanyahu's death are not so very exaggerated. We have now seen a bona fide double, literally an actor with a mask, giving addresses as Benjamin Netanyahu in the days that have followed some of those rumors that surfaced online. So, regardless of whether or not the man is dead or whether or not the man is incapacitated, he is no longer in control in the sense that you have an authentic reflection of that human being or of that hybrid being, however people want to look at that landscape and characterize that person. But that individual is no longer in control of the broader axis of what happens inside Tel Aviv. And so now one has to ask, who is really in control? And I would submit to you that you have patriots that have agreed to certain allied conditions with the U.S. military, with the Russian military, with even the Chinese military, certainly up to President Xi as part of that sort of insular group. And you also have those traitors inside of those nations that are sort of playing this back and forth, and they're losing the back and forth game. We know that Tel Aviv has taken a lot of direct hits from these missiles that have been coming out of Tehran. Those hits are not just indiscriminate hits on civilian infrastructure like Western world media would have you believe. A lot of them are hitting key industrial and chemical sites that are necessary to support Israel's illegal nuclear weapons program. The same is true of what's going on inside of Tehran. A lot of these airstrikes are hitting critical mineral facilities and critical enrichment facilities and nodes that feed those facilities with all sorts of things, from personnel to logistics to the chemical basis, the industrial basis, the metal framework and things like that. These architectural pieces are being destroyed to ensure that that arena can also not come out with a rogue nuclear program that then causes us a major destabilized event going forward down the road. When we look at the missiles that have been flying into Saudi Arabia, the Bahrain, UAE, there's been strikes in Syria. From what I understand, there's even been a hit inside of Turkey. Looking at where a lot of these are hitting, they're hitting intelligence community safe houses and research stations or bases that have been aligned with these black site projects inside of the U.S. Pentagon or inside of the Saudi Arabian Air Force or inside of the Israeli Defense Force and some of their off-book projects. A lot of them are taking direct hits from these strikes. And so when we look at what's happening here, this is a bit of a messy time because you have a movie component, but you also have a play out of the movie. I would even characterize it more as a play rather than a movie. A play has a script. A play has a basis of a plot. A play has an overarching cast of characters who are on one side and a cast of characters who are on the other side. But a play also has innovation built into the cake. A play utilizes improvisation at points where lines are forgotten or where things aren't working right or where technical displays malfunction. A play has actors that sort of bounce off of one another, but sometimes those actors have to switch out at the last minute because someone has a head cold and they can no longer perform their part, or someone is in a car accident on their way to the performance and so they can't be there that night. And so these types of things are occurring in real time at a geopolitical scale worldwide. And we have to keep in mind that the overarching objective is not war for war's sake, and it's not resource control either, and it's not nuclear weapons, even though we've been told that it is. It includes all of that, but the overall objective, is the disempowerment of the Hydra that has maintained shadow state control around the planet, utilizing a lot of these junction nodes to do so.
Very, very well said. I think that's an excellent analogy. This is like a live play that we're watching. And a play is dynamic, as you say. Things can happen, things can go wrong. So they have to improvise. That's an excellent analogy. And, as far as Netanyahu goes, they've made it so obvious now. First with the AI images and the hands and, things are just so obvious. Then with the mask, I mean, that is very, very shoddy work. So they did it on purpose for people to notice. The people in the alternative community, they've already known for some time that that's most likely not the real Netanyahu. But now the public at large are starting to notice as well. They're making it so obvious that it cannot be ignored anymore. And, that is on purpose as well. So people can start catching on to some of the narrative that's playing out behind the scenes, not reported by the mainstream media. Very, very interesting. I just wanted to quickly move to Taiwan. What do you think? Where are we with Taiwan? We were always told that China would take Taiwan at some point. It will be very quick and swift. I know that they surrounded Taiwan not too long ago. Do you think that is still coming? Has it been done? Has it been taken care of?
Well, I do think that there are negotiations that are happening, and it's not possible for me to fully corroborate this, but I just have an inkling based on the behavior of Taiwanese government officials towards the United States and towards Japan and even towards the Philippines. It seems very telling that there may be some back channel discussions happening between Beijing and Taipei. And that would make a lot of sense in the sense that, Taiwan is a relatively new invention of territorial separation. This goes back to the 1940s, 1950s. But before that, and for 1,000 years before that, Taiwan and China were essentially one and the same. You did have some more independently minded Chinese that sort of took up, the pioneering and the build out of Taiwan, if you will, not unlike the Americans that built the West in the early 19th century. They were still Americans, but they were sort of their own breed, a little bit of a cut above or a cut aside, if you will, from the standard model of individual, the post-colonial era. And so I would caution people to characterize things with that lens in mind because it's more complicated than geopolitics or military. You have culturalisms that have to be bridged here. You have some very deep divisions in consciousness that have to be bridged as well, because for as much rhetoric and saber rattling as we see from President Xi in Beijing, it is not their goal to just eradicate Taiwan and then move in and take it over. They want to reassimilate that culture and bring the benefits that have always been Chinese in that sense back from Taiwan onto the mainland and vice versa. And so we've known since 2022, when President Trump came out and essentially told the world China with Taiwan will be next, that this is going to occur at some point along the way. But we have to balance that against the economic situation and the military situation inside of China itself. China has a long history of being very, very difficult to conquer, but also being extremely patient about any response that they have towards what they perceive as adventurism or aggression or interference, right? We can look at the 18th century and the 19th century, and really we can rewind that all the way back to the days of Marco Polo to sort of see how China approaches this idea of outside interference with their what they believe to be internal cultural matters for the Chinese people and the post-dynastic Chinese world. And I'm not an expert in Chinese history, but I know that they have a very long and storied track record of being overly patient, even sometimes to the point of their own detriment, because they are mainly a peaceful people. They're not a militarized people, even though they have a dramatically powerful military in this day and time. And so looking at what's happening there, you have a couple of different factors that come into play with China. One is the debt leverage that exists inside of their economy, which is just absolutely enormous. It might be the most debt leveraged economy on earth. And I'm not a financial advisor, but I know that more than $150 trillion has been loaned into Beijing over the last 50 years, and most of those loans have not been paid back. So you're talking about a dramatic bubble that could be called, a note that could be called on Beijing at any point in time by those Western banking interests, and could cause some very serious internal strife almost immediately. You have a landscape that has only been industrializing itself really for about the past half century or so, and really in an accelerated fashion just over the last 35 to 40 years. That's not a long time when you're talking about sustaining an army of over 150 million. Or excuse me, a population with a potential for an army of over 150 million, or when you're talking about these massive metros like Guangzhou and Shanghai and Hong Kong and Beijing and others, which have millions of people conglomerated together, that requires a lot of resource sustainment and a lot of industrialization just to maintain the status quo that exists there. So any hiccup along that way could be very, very devastating to any forward plans that the Chinese military may have outside of the country. And I think President Xi walks a very fine line. He knows that the Chinese Communist Party is reviled by the Chinese people writ large. This is also a man who, when he was 9 years old, his father was murdered by that same Chinese Communist Party. So we shouldn't delude ourselves that he has any very affectionate romantic glasses for that group. This is, I think, an individual who is aligned with President Trump in his dislike of the intelligence community and his dislike of what has been done to his people and his culture. But he also understands the delicacy of the situation. He has been quietly removing generals for over 2 years now. He's actually had Congress Party members from the Chinese Communist Congress removed a couple of times by force, and we've been lucky enough to see a couple of those videos. It's only been about 3 months ago that another 6 or 7 generals were removed from Flag Officer Command. So this is a very high-ranking echelon with inside the Chinese military. They were removed with no explanation why, and they've not been seen again. So for all we know, they may very well could have been traitors. It's difficult to postulate, but that's something that comes to mind as a possibility. And you would have to make sure that that process is entirely complete before you begin any external military campaign, which could spiral out of control if it's not done very rapidly. And I mean very, very fast. This would have to occur with Taiwan probably inside of 5 to 7 days for them to go in and actually maintain a foothold. And I think you would have to have a lot of reciprocity on the side of Taiwan. In other words, not a whole lot of resistance on the ground inside of Taiwan in order for that foothold to maintain, because the Japanese tend to be very, very flighty in these types of dynamics and situations. And the Japanese and the U.S. are extremely close with one another from a resource exchange capacity, from a financial entwinement capacity. There's a lot of U.S. military that's right there on the Japanese islands, and that could become a bit of a stick in the scud pie, if you will, if there's any problems on the United States side of things. So looking at this situation, We've been talking about Taiwan being relatively imminent for a while, but it almost makes more sense that Taiwan would occur at a period of time where the United States military would not really be able to offer a great deal of resistance, or cause a great deal of thwarting of those activities happening on the South China Sea, and where the Japanese economy is not able to respond in a fashion that the Japanese island defense force could cause problems as well. And so, looking at what's happening inside of Iran, it's almost this beautiful tapestry. I keep coming back to this example because it's just so perfect. It's almost like this tapestry is being woven to ensure that the economic conditions inside of the Western world markets and inside of worldwide energy markets and shipping lanes, especially, are being created to sort of, bog those entities down, those other potentially problematic conditions down, while at the same time providing the impetus for China, especially, to do something about their resource dependency and to do it very quickly. And Taiwan does have some oil underneath the island, not a lot, but they certainly have enough to assist with the domestic pinch that the Chinese economy is currently undergoing. They also are very rich in precious minerals that come out of the seabed. There's a lot of mining that occurs in the South China Sea, a lot of dredge work that occurs down there, and so that would be a huge benefit to the Chinese economy as well. And at the same time, you have the Korea angle on this, you have the Japanese angle on this, both of which are being pinched right now with the events coming out of the Arabic and Persian Gulf, and that pinch is not likely to relent itself. So with China's alignment with Russia, that Korea and Japan, and neither of the Koreas and Japan really don't have, even despite Pyongyang's friendliness with Moscow, there's a much deeper trade alignment that exists between Beijing and Moscow. It's almost like you're seeing the reorientation in real time and the setup for a snap, sort of shock and awe campaign from China into Taiwan, and perhaps just a very rapid reunification where it's almost like you walk into the room first and then you ask forgiveness later. It's sort of easier to ask forgiveness than permission. And so what we're seeing, I think, right now is the setup for those events. But I don't believe that we arrive at that point until we see this conflict in the Persian Gulf begin to move itself to the next level. And when I say next level, I don't mean just regionally. I mean also the expansion of conflict in Eastern Europe, which is going to tie up a lot of the U.S. Army's resources in Europe to manage that dynamic and ensure that it doesn't spiral out of control. And the same is happening with Cuba, that President Trump has told us is going to come next. That will tie up a great deal of naval assets that the United States has to offer, many of which are deployed to the Pacific theater of operations right now. They'll have to come back and assist in that because all of those Atlantic assets are currently sitting in the Mediterranean. So you're seeing how this is being moved around in such a way where things are likely to escalate for a period of time as these real territorial advances begin to take hold. We know that with Ukraine, especially, Russia has already said a couple of times that they are going to recapture Odessa before this process can be considered over from their side of the fence. Odessa is a massive strategic goal for Russia. It remains the only port city inside of Ukraine that Ukraine does any amount of export and importation through. And so to lose Odessa would absolutely cripple the Zelensky regime in Kiev and would cause almost an immediate response, I think, from that intelligence community infestation that exists inside of the Baltic states. So this is a bit of a game of brinkmanship, if you will, and we're seeing it happen in real time. But I could see Taiwan and China kicking off at a point where the Western world and the Russian component and the general NATO component of the West are simply not able to reinforce their allies in Japan, Korea, the Philippines, and basically where they tell them, I could see something along the lines where they have to say, look, we want to do as much as we can to provide security in your region, but at this point, it's going to be all we can do just to ensure that you are not next.
Incredible. And I think we chatted about this before we started recording, but how the deep state has set up shop in all of these countries over 100 years, systematically and strategically changing the trajectory of entire countries, of entire cultures, like Persia, Iran being a prime example, China, the CCP, how that transformed. All of these countries that have completely and utterly been transformed by the deep state because of their presence there. And it's just incredible to think about, how all of that history can be reversed in a way. But I guess there's no reversal. But, the entire way that populations think today, that they have been indoctrinated with in a new way, which is outside of in a way, their original culture and the way they would have thought had that interference not happened. Um, I don't know if I'm describing this correctly, but it's quite something to picture and to think about how the world would have been different without that, and what needs to happen for the unbrainwashing of the masses in all of these countries. Even though you say, for example, in China, that most people are not in support of the CCP, but most of them have very subconsciously still been indoctrinated into a certain way of thinking. Certain old traditions have been completely banned in China because, it inspires free thinking. It inspires people to know their worth and to ask critical questions. So it's been beaten out of them in a way that obey and follow the rules, and this is how things are done, and it's always been done, and look how advanced we are. So just keep going, follow the line. Yeah, it's quite incredible to think about how a lot of that damage will be undone once this is all said and done for. Once these cabal tentacles, this octopus tentacles, have been removed from all of these different countries, and there are so many of them. I'm just using a few examples. I mean, South America, yeah, there's so much going on there as well. Africa, um, it's incredible to think how these countries can one day start thriving again, how the people can start, thinking for themselves critically again, uh, return even to a more healthy state, because people can't think properly when their health has been compromised, when their food has been poisoned, their water has been poisoned. So it really is an absolutely biblical time that we're living through. And this operation is absolutely um, so much bigger than we can ever grasp. I don't know
It
if
is
you agree
truly
with that.
mind blowing. And I want to double down on what you're talking about just for a moment, because what you're characterizing is the rediscovery of who each culture and who each nation state is by the people who reside there and who have ancestral ties to the land. And you're right, it exists across the entirety of the planet because there has been malfeasance that exists across the entirety of the planet. There has been manipulation of the African tribalistic mindset, for example, going all the way back to the early 19th century. And really even before that, but definitely the early 19th century forward, there's been a lot of Western world manipulation and sort of opportunistic advantage taking that occurred in sub-Saharan Africa and in Western Africa. The same is true of South America post 1920s. The same is true of Eastern Europe post World War I and World War II, especially. And so, looking at what's happening now, this is a sequence of events that's unfolding in the world that, in my opinion, could only have been contrived by God Almighty, because it's that broad and that vast and that all encompassing. But it allows for each of these cultures to look back at their roots and who they are and who they have always been and decide, how do we want to be going forward into this new world? And we can clearly see that there is a new world emerging. Forget the content about financial revaluations and changing of economies. There is a new spiritual dynamic that is emerging between human beings, where more value is being placed on life, more value is being placed on the lived life experience of people, more value is being placed on the elders in the Western world, more value is being placed on the youth in both the Western and Eastern worlds, more value is being placed on advancement and technology as a benefit rather than a threat in the post-tribalistic world, to include Africa and South America and other areas as well, and Southeast Asia. So all of this, I think, leads us to this broader discussion that is impossible to prognosticate, because we can't possibly foresee where these cultures will end up going, as a final arrangement, if you will, or as a final concept and mentality of who they want to be. But we do know that when we pull the thumb off of the scale, there will be a reckoning of some kind. There's going to be a rebalancing that does occur. A prime example, and perhaps the most relatable that I can give your audience, is the Baltic states in Eastern Europe. Up until World War II, those states were all part of Mother Russia. and they were part of Mother Russia for 800 years prior to the 20th century. Lithuania and Vilnius was a Russian city. Estonia was a Russian territory leading right up to St. Petersburg. Latvia has always characterized itself as Russian. The people of Latvia, even just a few years ago, there was a poll conducted inside of Latvia. 68% of Latvians identified themselves as Russians first and sort of as Latvian second, much like a Texan would identify themselves as an American first, but a Texan second. And so the same thing, and we've talked about this with Ukraine as well. The same is true of Ukraine, but the Baltic states have been bathed in this Radio Free Europe propaganda about who they are and who Russia is, and how the Soviets have been doing things, and how the West has been doing things for over 50 years at this point, really in a hard way, actually more than 70 years at this point. And so looking at that, you have a couple of generations now that have been birthed inside of these nations who do not understand who they are, and they don't really respect their elders and the history and culture that the elders have known and are able to maintain until the present day and time, provided that they're still with us and alive. There's not been that respect for them, because that has been drummed out of most of those post-World War II Eastern European cultures as well. It's all about the new. It's all about the advancements. It's all about getting rid of the old, archaic, useless ways, right? This is the same sort of attitude that was applied to post-World War II Britain, post-World War II America even. And so looking at that broader lens, you have massive cultural identity. You have a cultural identity crisis that exists inside of the Baltic states. And that has to be reconciled in this process. And whether it is reconciled through some sort of territorial reclamation by Russia at gunpoint, or whether it is reconciled through a diplomatic cooperative that brings the Baltic states out of NATO and maybe establishes them as their own separate group that asks for protectionism from Russia but wants to maintain their autonomy to a degree. We really don't know how that's going to happen, but the resurgence of I am Russian first is going to occur. The same is true with the Ukraine, and we could look at all of the Ukrainian cities going back to World War II to understand that this was Mother Russia before the Soviet Union had itself piecemealed throughout the 20th century. And even after the Second World War, the Soviets were very, very adamant about not giving up certain components of their westernmost borders, and Ukraine was a big part of that. They were willing to part ways with the Baltic for various reasons that are sort of beyond my pay grade geopolitically, but I know that those partings occurred. But that was not the case in the central component of their westernmost border, which is modern day Ukraine and Belarus. And so looking at what we have now, that area does not understand who they are and has not understood who they are for a couple of generations. And that problem exists worldwide in most cultures, to include the Chinese, to include the Taiwanese, to include even the Japanese to some degree, because of their very close relationship with the NATO, sort of like the NATO of the Pacific, if you will, South Korea and the United States and Hawaii and things of that nature. Korea is another good example of this. Until the early 1950s, Korea was one country and had been one country for 1,500 years. This was the same culture, the same group of people. And I think as we go forward here, you're going to see reunification of the Korean Peninsula, whether that comes, again, at gunpoint from North Korea, or whether that comes as a mutual Anschluss style arrangement that brings the two of those nations together and maintains the peaceability of that arrangement, but nonetheless binds those cultures as one nation again. I'm not sure what that progression is going to be. It's probably above my pay grade to postulate, but I know that it has to occur, because we cannot have peace on earth, if you will, peace in our time, goodwill amongst men, without solving some of these ancestral problems that were created not by our cultures, not by the progression of human events unadulterated as it has been and as it should be, but by manipulation by external environmental forces and actors who stayed in the shadows and did not even declare their own presence, who benefited from that manipulation.
Yeah, very well said. And actually, that makes me think about, the concept of countries is actually a relatively modern concept. So if we look at a couple of centuries ago, a good couple of centuries ago, it was more driven, it was more territory driven than it was country driven. So what we perhaps know as Russia then was more like a Russian territory, perhaps. The way China is now, because China is as big as a continent. China is huge, as a country. So I think the way it used to be is more that the world was managed in terms of territories, not countries so much. All these like millions of borders everywhere was not really a thing back then, but and I'm talking many centuries, I can't pinpoint exactly, but it makes me think about how we're often told that we're going to go back to being seven kingdoms, managed by seven kingdoms. So, at some point in the next decades, I don't know what, maybe it's sooner, I'm just being conservative, perhaps we won't have countries that are so tightly managed in terms of its borders with a president for every country, but rather a kingdom which will be like a territory, the Africas, Africa and Middle East and, sort of Russian, sort of that Eastern Europe bloc, um, you know, Asia. So much more managed in terms of territories. And I get this feeling we kind of going back in a way. We're not inventing something new, but rather going back to how things used to be. And that perhaps the whole idea about splitting the world into so many different countries is actually also part of a nefarious plan to divide and conquer, What do you think about that?
Well, I have to say, it probably gets a little bit into philosophy, which isn't my expertise by any means, but I love to engage with it because it causes us to be a little bit self-reflective about the dynamics that we have in the world as it stands right now. And I think that, as we look at what happens going forward, whether we maintain territorial boundaries and call them countries, whether we, reestablish different territorial boundaries and we call them spheres of influence or regional spheres of influence that are either assisted or managed by a coalition like the African Union, for example, or the ASEAN, I think it's ASEAN sphere. It's the Association of East Asian Nations, I think is what it stands for. Regardless of how it comes out and comes to bear, I think you're going to see a unification of cooperation in the sense that you may have countries that decide to change their overall demographic and their overall makeup, like with the Korean Peninsula, for example, or with what used to be French Indochina, and a lot of that being a part of this sort of post-Chinese dynastic area that existed in Southeast Asia that has been fragmented into several different distinct Asian cultures, all with distinct languages. Again, it's probably not my expertise to opine too much on it, so I don't want to mislead your audience, but I would not be surprised if we start to see a lot of this remanagement or stylization of management begin to emerge forth in the world, not unlike what the United States is doing with the Western Hemisphere. Under President Trump right now, the United States is essentially adopting the role of the big brother of the Western Hemisphere. Don't mess around in our hemisphere. And all of these nations that are in our hemisphere with us, there are allies, there are friends, there are neighbors, but they're also distinct groups that we characterize as Western Hemisphere groups. And so they're all in our clique, if you will. They're all in our club, and we're going to stand up for that club. And we're also going to clean out that club whenever that club threatens the rest of the group as a whole. Sort of like the big brother that walks in amongst the 10 warring siblings and knocks the heads of the two biggest ones so that the other 8 fall into line and sort of knock off the conflict. I think that's the same role that the United States is playing inside of the Western Hemisphere. I think it's the exact same role that Russia is playing in Eastern Europe right now and in portions of Africa and certainly the Caucasus area, extending down into the Middle East and even the Mediterranean to a degree. Russia is shaping the politics that occur in that area. They're certainly facing down the teeth of the intelligence community inside of Eastern Europe and inside of the Baltic area of influence and even up into the Scandinavian area of influence, which includes a lot of that same infestation, especially in Sweden. But what is happening, what is coming out of Russia right now is this forced recalculation by all of these various regional actors about how they're going to operate. The African component of that is a big deal. because Russia has essentially ensured that certain African nations who seek to disconnect from Washington, D.C. and the West do not go belly up and run into situations of famine or just out of control civil war and anarchy, because the Russians have stepped in and they have offered grain supplies, energy supplies, equipment, militarized training, in some cases, even sending small components of military divisions to assist those nations with maintaining order as they go through that transformative process. And so that creates a sense of loyalty, not necessarily, I think, a sense of dependency, but a sense of I can rely on you in a pinch if something happens where things sort of go off of the rails. I think that you're seeing the same thing beginning to emerge with the broader Asian sphere. And it would not surprise me if Japan and China eventually come to some sort of maybe it's at first a tense agreement that turns into a mutually beneficial agreement where they agree to sort of maintain the status quo in the Far East Asian Rim and in the broader Pacific theater, because that has ancestrally been the home of both of them. And not to disinclude the Koreans, but it really has been the Chinese, the Mongolians, and the Japanese who have maintained the stability and the overall imprint of how things flow forward in time and linear time throughout the entirety of East Asia and Central Asia as well. And there's this broader cooperation now that exists between Beijing and Moscow, which I think really helps to sort of ballast that, keeping Beijing afloat as they seek to divest themselves from U.S. treasuries, to navigate the current energy market pinch. Japan will also be in a pinch relatively soon, I believe, because of the things that are occurring in the world. And so that could force these conversations to the table where regionally these cultures have to start relying on one another again, rather than existing in this form of sort of like enmity and adversarialness that has gone on for a long time, especially between cultures like the Japanese and the Chinese. So looking at what's happening, it could result in a redefinition of countries. Don't get me wrong. I think that's a reasonable possibility that comes forward of this. But one thing it absolutely is resulting in, and we're seeing it happen right now, is a different mindset emerging inside of all of these different nation states about who they are and who their friends are. And so as we look at Western Europe and their proximity to the United States through NATO, but yet sort of their unwillingness to move in any direction, if you will, with respect to what's going on with Russia, with respect to what's going on in the Middle East, with respect to the things that have happened in Africa, the post-colonial African resurgence here that's gone on in these last few years. I think that Europe is sort of undergoing an identity crisis of its own in many regards. And I think it's likely that we see certain cultures in Central Europe and Central Northern Europe, like Poland, for example, and the Czechs and the Slovaks begin to gravitate more towards that friendliness that they've always had with the Russians. The French actually were even very friendly with the Russians up until, I believe it was Tsar Alexander III, if I'm not mistaken. And at the same time, made the maintaining of that goodwill across the pond, but maybe putting a little bit of distance between their dependency on the United States of America and allowing the American system and really the broad Western hemisphere to shape their values, when for a very long time it was sort of the other way around. It's very interesting to see how these things are playing out and how cultures are beginning to re-examine their history, re-examine who they are and what they are about. But where that goes is probably an answer best reserved for God Almighty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. It's very complex and very nuanced, and it's going to be interesting. What I can say. I want to take a little bit of a different direction. I know we don't have too much time left, but I wanted to ask you just about the comms that we are seeing coming out of the White House. They've just launched an app, which is interesting. So, kind of direct communication to the public, if you will, not relying on the mainstream media to, interpret and anything as such. Direct line of communication. We've seen a lot of interesting comms around, let's just say, celebrities that are supposedly dead. Trump celebrating last week, with Elvis at his estate. I forgot what he's called now, but he signed one of his guitars, and I think that was also on the anniversary of his first album coming out, if I'm not mistaken. There's been some comms around Michael Jackson just a day or two ago. And then, of course, JFK Jr., the movie that's just come out. And it just feels like the narrative is building towards something. And many people believe none of these three characters are actually deceased. Have you got any commentary on that? I just find it very curious how these narratives are starting to build. You can see them being seeded into the media and how they are building and building and building. And you're wondering, where is this going? And when is something going to pop off and be announced?
Well, I think that's a fascinating question, and it starts getting into the meat and potatoes of a lot of what Anons have been telling the world for a long time. Things are not as they seem. Um, there is such a thing as people faking their own deaths. There is such a thing as people being extracted into programs like witness protection for one reason or another. These types of occurrences in the course of human events do occur, and they actually occur with greater frequency than a lot of people would be willing to acknowledge. At the same time, it is very difficult to walk back some of those cultural understandings without some sort of major event or major sequence of events playing out. So I would characterize, all of the examples that you gave and many more as, crumbs along the way to show us that patriots are in control, not necessarily to show us about perhaps an upcoming reveal of any kind or, a major change in cultural understanding about the idea of who is alive and who isn't alive. At some point, we may see some of that. I wouldn't put anything past anything in this day and age, given the things that we've all endured since COVID. But I would not. I probably would not gravitate towards the idea that we're going to shock the consciousness with those types of realizations prior to other major things being accomplished. And one of those things is the disclosure of extraterrestrial life. Humanity has to come to understand that we are not alone in the universe, and that we're not alone under the cosmos. We are a part of a grander chorus of all creation, and that chorus is beautiful and wonderful and balances out, God Almighty in a way that I think we've often sort of placed him in a box, and that's not necessarily a good characteristic. I'm trying to be very deliberate about the terminology here, but fundamentally, that realization, when we cross that Rubicon of understanding as a collective humanity, it will unlock so much more. It will unlock the nature of the earth and the discussion about, well, what is the true nature of the earth? Does it have layers to it? Are there chasms beneath the earth that are functional as civilizational components themselves? Do we have areas of this world that are not explored? Is our current earth map incorrect or perhaps incomplete? What exists out there beyond just our, astronomical understanding that we've gleaned since the early 1950s, when we know that the intelligence community had a vested interest in preventing humanity from understanding that they were not alone. I think that major Rubicon, that singular that singular point, will help to drive some of the more difficult realizations that you referenced just a moment ago. And whether or not we see individuals make a resurgence as, I'm actually still alive, whether or not we see a different story being told about how they were actually, what happened when they disappeared from society and when they actually did pass away. Those are questions that are probably reserved for someone a little bit deeper into those particular research nuances, and that's not my forte. But I can say that the openness of the consciousness to accepting a new story, to accepting a new history and a new sequence of how things have progressed over the decades with respect to individuals that were suddenly gone from public life and were very beloved, is going to hinge, I think, a great deal on how we view ourselves collectively as a human civilization occupying this earth and living upon this earth. This earth was given to us, but we know from various spiritual books of faith, we know from a lot of archaeological history, that it was not given to us in the sense that we were the only ones here. We know that there have been confrontations that have occurred in days of yore where entities that did not wish humanity pleasant niceties and good feelings were attempting to seize control of the planet away from us. We know that even in the very earliest days, that the Garden of Eden, it eventually became the domain of something else because Adam and Eve were escorted and ushered out of the garden by God. We know that these types of infiltrations have occurred in the bloodline of mankind and of humanity, because that's what our deep state Luciferian occultic enemy believes. And they have access to a great deal of this history because they themselves have been the ones hiding that history. When we see the records eventually that emerge from beneath the vaults of the Vatican, and I'm looking very much forward to those days where we see that disclosure beginning to sort of pick up in the public narrative. I think we'll be very surprised at about how much of, say, the books of Genesis and Job and others in the Bible, or the very old books in the Zohar or the Mahabharata, the omitted text from that, or the Apocrypha that was omitted from the New Testament. The histories that they describe, the sequences of events inside of mankind's journey through time here in this world. I think we're going to be very surprised and hopefully very encouraged to know that while we may not be alone, we have always had a back and forth. There's always been a balance that exists here in this world, and it was always given to us. And once that begins to percolate and be accepted into the consciousness as a real thing, I think then we can start handling these issues of, well, who's dead or who's not dead, or how did that actually go down, or what was the sequence of events that actually occurred here or with that person or with this person, what was actually going on in the background. But it's a delicate operation because you don't want to disrupt the continuity of consciousness to the point where it's unrecoverable. It's sort of like you tell someone difficult news a little bit at a time, because if you give them the raw and ragged truth all at once, they're just going to put their heads in their sand and refute it and fight against it. And that's not what we want. We want a transmutation from the old understanding to the new understanding, but not a rejection of either. We want this sort of continuity to seed into the consciousness so that we all come to understand who we are, what our capabilities are, what our true spiritual identity is, and where we stand amongst this grand chorus of creation, which is much bigger and broader than any of us give it credit for.
Yeah, very well said. And definitely the UFO/alien agenda seems to be also a narrative that's currently being seeded and built over time. We know that the files are going to be released, all the hidden and secret files are going to be released related to all of these topics. And so, yeah, the question is just when and how. But it looks like we're in for a very eventful April. Um, it definitely looks like it's going to be a big one. Certainly, perhaps, well, I think certainly as far as the financial markets, we will see something happening, perhaps something to do with the files related to UFOs, UAPs, aliens. There has been whistleblowers disappearing, and all of these things are kind of being seeded into the consciousness as well. Um, but it's very encouraging to see that, we are being readied for some of the information to come out in the public. A lot of the information that many of us may already know, um, it will be really, really rewarding to see some of this come out in the public space. And you're right, some of this very sort of raw and shocking news has to be delivered in bite-sized chunks in order to be digested by the masses, because some people can't seem to understand why they can't just come out with all the truth and give it to people as it is. But they live in their own reality, and if they know what the alternative reality actually is like to be living in on a day-to-day basis, I think they'll have a much better understanding why it has to be done in this way, why it has to be done in the bite-sized chunks, so that the consciousness of the collective can catch up to what they're about to hear, which is, absolutely going to be mind-blowing and exciting at the same time. So yeah, I'm looking forward to April, no doubt. Um, and I'm sure you do too.
Indeed, and it's very interesting on this topic. If we can close this segment off with recapping sort of this broad understanding that people have to come to. The Vice President of the United States was just on a broadcast a few days ago, I think with the journalist Benny Johnson, discussing the concept of UAPs, UFOs, aliens, extraterrestrials, things like that. And this is a man who comes from a Protestant Christian understanding. He's very relatable with evangelical America. He is very much what I would characterize as a mainstream figure to be having these types of conversations. And he referred to the concept of non-terrestrials as, potentially demonic entities. And we know just from what we've seen in the Epstein releases that there has to be some sort of spirit of evil that afflicts individuals out there. And we also know from our holy book itself that there was a tainting of the bloodline at some point along the way of the crystalline bloodline of Adam on down through the centuries and the generations. The flood of Noah was not the only great deluge that occurred, but it occurred because of what Noah represented, this unadulterated bloodline from the creation of humanity at its inception, ostensibly by God Almighty, and that Holy Spirit animating, into the earth as we were told that it does. And so, looking at Mr. Vance's comments, Vice President Vance's comments, this is a way to roll out the red carpet, if you will, or crack the doorway for that group, that demographic of the population to come around to accepting that they are not alone in the world. And it's also, excuse me, it also positions us to have a broader discussion about, well, if there are demons, are there angels? If there are evil entities, are there light-based positive entities? Do we have allies in this broader discussion about who we are amongst the grand chorus of all creation? We know certainly that we have enemies. We can see that just from COVID and the luciferase that ended up in vaccines. We know for sure that there are opponents of humanity, but do we have allies? And if we do, what do our holy books say about them? Do any of the omitted texts from our holy books talk about who these allies maybe are or who these opponents maybe are? Do we have lore that we can draw from Native American cultures or from First Nation indigenous traditions, mostly oral traditions, to sort of glean an understanding about how this has all occurred? And Vice President Vance capped that segment of his discussion by saying that he was going to personally tour Area 51. Now, that in and of itself is not as magnanimous, I think, as a lot of Anons would like it to be, because we know that a great deal of that research was moved out of Area 51 during the H.W. Bush administration in the early 1990s. But some of it still remains. The point is, it is a facility that the United States government told the world forever didn't exist. We know that it did exist. We know at one point in time it did play host to research on terrestrial biologics. We know at one point in time it was used for reverse engineering and examination of non-terrestrial technology. And at the same time that Vice President Vance is saying he's going to personally go there and put eyes on it, we've got a number of congressmen from the U.S. House and U.S. Senate, Congressman Burchett being one of them, who have been very open and vocal about their belief that there are non-terrestrial civilizations or components of a non-terrestrial civilization that exist here in the world and that are living underneath our oceans right now. So looking at what's happening, you can sort of see how the broad understanding is being slowly changed over time, but it is not refuting the basic spiritual lens and the religious understanding of most of the Western world and a great deal of the global South as well. It's sort of seeking to incorporate it because it is all part of the same truth. But when we look at what our deep state opponent has done to that broad body of truth over a period of several thousand years, it becomes easy to see how it is pretty significantly moth-eaten, and we have to come from that understanding and begin to put those pieces back into that thread, into that fabric again, so that we understand, what our history has been in relation to these entities, what our history has been in relation to control of this planet, how long have we not had control of this planet, how do we maintain autonomy and control of this planet in a way that is reflective of what God would want and what God's will, I think, is for all of humanity. And those questions have to be entertained by all of us in a unified fashion. It's really actually epic to watch because it is a transformative event in the course of human destiny that has not ever been had in a conscious way ever before. And the positives, the reverberations for the positive proliferation and longevity for humanity, the progeny of humanity is the word I'm looking for, that can't be understated, or excuse me, overstated in any capacity. We're talking about redefining what it means to live life here in this world and redefining our understandings of how grand and vast and majestic this universe that we all live in really is.
Very well put. And you're absolutely right. This is like a massive multi-pronged truth seeding campaign to different target groups at different levels of consciousness and understanding. So when JD Vance says something like that, perhaps aliens are demons, a lot of people are like, oh, well, that's not good. But you have to remember who he's really talking to, who is really targeting with that sentence. I think people forget there's so many different little mini, it's like a marketing campaign of truth delivered to each target audience in a way that they will understand, they will fully be able to process and digest. And a lot of time people forget that. So I see it as a very, very exciting thing that's currently happening. And yeah, let's just say life will never be the same, and this world will never be the same. And we're moving at breakneck speeds forward now into the new world. So many things are converging and coming together, and I literally feel like it's this, we're at this threshold moment of things really coming together in a way. And yes, there's still going to be a lot of things going on in the world to this end for quite some time. But I feel like we're about to take a massive leap forward into a new world and into a better way of being, if you will, a more positive way of living together, as different cultures, and to, working towards getting rid of poverty, lack, um, uh, just the idea of limited resources around the world. Even I believe, in a way, the oil crisis in the Middle East that we seem to be seeing unfolding, eventually maybe that's an opportunity to start introducing more free energy. So we have to look at all these things in a positive way and see how things are shifting fast now. And I think everyone, as you say, just have to have trust that things are unfolding in the right way. And instead of watching every single detail and criticizing every single detail, actually see what you can do in this process to help the world move along. How you can develop your own consciousness, your own level of thinking, your own sovereignty, your own, creating your own little pockets of free and sovereign ways of living, because it's we the people that are going to be creating this new world, co-creating this new world. It's not only up to the military and the white hats and all the help that we have to physically co-create this new world that we're stepping into. So yeah, we all have a massive responsibility in this regard as well. So it's exciting, daunting, and incredibly rewarding at the same time.
Very well said. And if I can add to close that out, this whole process is resulting in a transformation of how human beings treat each other and how human beings see one another. And that will be reflected in how we treat the world around us, and vice versa. How we treat the world is reflected in how we treat each other also. And looking at the types of things that we want, the elimination of poverty, the elimination of true hunger situations that exist in cultures and nations around the planet, the elimination of human trafficking and the black market that supports it, the elimination of um, undeclared civilizational influences. And we could characterize that as the intelligence community or the underground component, where we know that, certain experimentations have gone on, which have resulted in entire subgroups of the human species that are not fully known to people, right? All of these things, we want those to be brought out and eliminated. We want their inverse to be the order of the day: abundance, prosperity, joyful living, generally speaking, not without its difficulties, because, Christ told us himself the world is not without its trials and without its tribulations, and likely is never going to be, but a rebalancing of how things really should be and how they are, how it is possible to make them. That is what we all seek to have. And we cannot have that until we have the moral fortitude to acknowledge that we have been manipulated into a way of understanding one another and a way of doing business with and treating each other that is not beneficial, and most of the time does not actually reflect what God would want, right? When we talk about, the divine Holy Spirit that sustains everything, and that we go to the church house on Sunday and we pay homage to and we give our worship and praise to, very seldom is that reflected in the conversation between the debt collector and the debtor, or the individual that is, really having a rough day and snaps at someone in the grocery store line, or the man who, is just doing his job for whatever organization has brought slight upon all of us, such as the banking institutions or the security apparatus, right? We have to keep in mind that the translation from the concept to the actual practice, the actual application and execution, it has to be seamless and it has to be total and true. And that's what we're living through, in my opinion, is a grand period of time where God is not only salvaging the human race and the human species, preventing us from that crazy depopulation, transhumanistic, hellscape that was envisioned for humanity by these Luciferian occultists at the very top. But at the same time that that is being prevented and thwarted, we are being given the opportunity, if I can use the terminology, to level up as human beings with one another. And doing so, moving forward in this world, is the only way that we achieve those conditions that we would characterize as sort of like utopic adjacent. It doesn't mean that work goes away. It doesn't mean that there's no such thing as debt ever. It doesn't mean that there's not, moments in time where things are a little lean or a little difficult, or that we're not going to be faced with emotional challenges the same as every human culture throughout all of history has been faced with. But it does mean that we can achieve a standard, an overall playing field that is much more fair, is much more balanced, and is much more reflective of what God would want for us with respect to our attitudes towards one another and our attitudes towards this planet. And we have to make that leap before we can take this planet back. This is our kingdom. But are we really ready for the kingship? I think that's the thing that people have to acknowledge and reflect about. And if you can sit back and say, yes, I think I'm ready for the kingship, then I would certainly love to meet you, because I don't know very many people who truly have achieved that holistic viewpoint. I certainly have not have achieved that holistic viewpoint and understanding where they consider their learning journey sort of complete in that way. I think that we all are sort of learning as we go, but we are being made better because of it. And it's just a matter of maintaining our faith in the outcome, maintaining our vision for where we know we want to go, and refusing to settle for anything less, but not in a militant and violent or forcefully resistant way, because that's not how God has taught us through a number of different spiritual masters. Christ himself being, I think, the ultimate, the apex of those masters, the example that he gave us throughout the entirety of the New Testament. That is simply not how we're called to be. And if we can rise to that new level, that higher method of operation with one another and that attitude with one another, the things we can accomplish here on this planet are just limitless.
Very, very well said. Thank you. I think that closes out beautifully. We are going to have to be guardians of this planet, true guardians of this planet. And as you say, that takes a great deal of responsibility and work, inner work as well. So, but it's been an absolute joy and a pleasure to chat to you again, SG. Thank you so much for making time tonight. And well, it's my night and your midday or afternoon. And looking forward to seeing where things are going and how things will unfold until we meet next. But thank you for everything that you do, and I want to encourage everyone to go and check out SG Anon's various links, which I'll leave in the video description below. Go and check him out on Rumble if you haven't already. I'm sure you have already followed him, but in case you haven't, and yeah, just keep up the great work and keep on inspiring others. And we really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you as well, Nina. Thank you for having me back. God bless everybody.
Thanks, everyone. See you soon.